Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. My name is Jeroen. I'm the coordinator of the EduCen project, a European-funded project on cities, catastrophes, and cultures, in which we try to understand the role of culture in disaster, not only as something that can be problematic, but also as something that can be an asset when working with disaster-affected people in the preparation and the response phase. We are working from Wageningen University in the Netherlands as coordinators, and we are joined by 10 to 11 partners in Europe. Uh, 7 cities are mostly in southern Europe are involved. One in the north, the city of Dordrecht in the Netherlands, and research organizations, game makers, water managers, all kinds of people from different social sectors exchanging information and experiences to get better at handling the issue of disaster and culture. The program for today will soon introduce ourselves and hope that you would do the same. And while you say who you are, please also think if there is a topic that you would like discussed in this first webinar of EduCen. What kind of topic is close to your heart or your work that you would like to discuss on disaster and culture? What kind of question would you like to ask of the others so that you can work better or research better on disaster and culture? Despite our project having started last year, we still haven't quite worked out how to empirically define culture. There are plenty of textbook definitions, but how do you actually define culture before it flies you in the face, before it hits you and makes you say ouch, as our team member Peter Thomas tends to say, how do you ask a fish about the water they swim in? It's not so easy to talk about culture, but you know it when you feel it. But let's see how we can make it operational and practicable, also with a view to our major project output, which is an e-book, a kind of handbook to help practitioners work with disaster and culture. I'm joined by 3 ladies in this room. First, our deputy project manager, Lieke van der Zouwen. You already heard her voice starting this webinar. Soon you'll hear and see Karen Engel. She's finishing her PhD on disaster culture, both in South America and in Europe, 2 cases, earthquakes, floods. And there's Mona Regad, who is supporting us as a kind of intern and will be taking notes in case needed, and will also join us in the conversation. That's us. And then the question is, who are you? I think most people who are now participating are part of the EduCen project. Please, we're going to open the floor. Can you please introduce yourself and say what your topic question is that you would like discussed in your in this seminar? After that, we will have the 2 presentations. First by myself, a few slides on introductory culture and interculturality, and then from Karen Engel, more specifically on culture in DRR. Shall we open the floor, or is it already open? Who's first?
Okay, well, since most of you are people from our own consortium, we already know each other, but rather than introducing yourself, it would be useful if you would tell us what you would like to get out of this, or what you would like to know, what you want us to tell about culture. And so what are your questions, or what do you want to hear from us? And then Jeroen and Karen, they can adjust their presentations to your specific questions. So just click ask a question in case you have questions, and then we will maybe answer them.
Here's the first one. Mona.
Yes, Lieke and Karen, hello. I was interested in when you send the invitation, why do you frame it as culture in urban disasters? What is so special about the urban settings that you were questioning the idea of culture? Is that a specific urban culture that might impact the way people respond in disasters?
Thank you very much. Other questions? If not, I will address your question first now. The easy answer is it is about European cities, the topic. But of course, there's a reason why we chose this topic. Most people now in the world live in cities, more than 50%. And most people who live in cities are fairly recent arrivals. But especially those who are, for example, second or third generation urban dwellers have often lost the kind of urban survival skills that they need to survive in longer periods of discomfort, of upset. So while people in the countryside may be used to storing up on wood, logs, fuel, on food, on have big machinery to take the snow off your house or take away fallen trees or whatever obstacles there might be. In cities, people do not have that, and because people are more densely populated, more densely packed together in a urban situation, often that's a multi-story housing. When something goes wrong, it goes wrong for a lot of people, and it's not so easy to save them, especially if there is a kind of quick onset disaster like an earthquake. So urban disasters have their own dynamics, specifically to do with little space and many people, and strong dynamics of disaster. At the same time, urban areas are hotbeds of entrepreneurship and innovation, or can be, so that if new ideas develop, often it happens in cities. So that makes the urban, among other reasons, pretty special. Okay, I think I'll start my presentation. It's in PowerPoint form, and if you should have questions anyway, then please use the chat function so that we can give you the floor. We'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So if all is well, you now see in your on your screen the EduSen logo developed by Funda Atun for our our work, which is very nice looking, four colored four-leaf clover, as well as the European framework one. So that is our project. However, the slides that you see have been devised by a colleague of mine, Bram Jansen, who also worked in the disasters studies subgroup of the social sciences group in Wageningen. Bram gives a presentation, regularly give presentations on what is culture in humanitarian aid in crisis situation. And we found them helpful, and we were allowed to use them, but Bram couldn't join us today, to explain some introduction to how to recognize disasters before they hit you in your face. So culture can be described as a system of knowledge, norms, beliefs, and symbols, as the terms through which groups understand and interpret the world, or institutional arrangements within which social life takes place. Cultural studies tend to fall into two categories. One is to understand the objects. Why do certain objects, rituals, symbols look the way they do, which include memorials, landscape, signs of how high the flood was in the Dutch case, 1953 or 1926. But there's another one which I guess we are most interested in, and that's culture as reasons behind behavior, why people behave in a certain way and interact in a certain way with each other. Things that make you from culture A think, why do they in culture B do that the way they do? And how have they organized, institutionalized these behaviors in institutions? A lot of culture is what you don't see at surface glance. It is you only see and experience the tip of the iceberg, as represented in this particular slide. You see overboard, above board. You see a certain aspects of culture that you don't see but feel, especially a clash of values, which is the bottom line in the iceberg, the underwater part of the iceberg, which are where it's very hard to convince the other. When people have different values, it's often something that they are quite attached to. So when you interact with each other, when you negotiate with each other, you can talk about interests, you can talk about the look and feel of things, but values are often non-negotiable. So you better respect them and deal with them rather than trying to change them. It's very hard to change someone's core values. As I already said, it's hard to ask a fish why and how he swims in particular water. That's just what they do. It's because it seems normal. Some like hot water, some like cold, some like turbid water, some like clear water. That's just how they have come to act, and some nature, some nurture aspects. The way that things are done around here is what people feel and intuitively do as expressions of culture. That means that if you think that certain things are normal, then whatever others do differently may seem to be the wrong way. Why don't people just do it like us? And in interaction between cultures, these are the things that most obviously are different and annoying or surprising or intriguing. So there's a normal level of otherness, which we kind of accept, which facilitates routine and social organization. But of course, there's also cultural difference that annoys and frustrates, that brings taboos or that brings alienation. And we're also interested in the kinds of cultural expressions that fascinate because they are so useful, helpful, the kind of cultural repertoires that people have developed in response to disasters. Cultural identities often come from a response to disaster that people are repeatedly exposed to, like the Dutch identify with the fight against the water, the storms, floods, and river floods, and others may identify with repeated earthquakes or droughts or volatility of the weather that people have become accustomed to and take pride in being able to live where they live and live the way they live. But that brings certain behaviors that someone who has not been exposed to that environment does not relate to. It is very easy to stereotype culture, but actually it is too simple to say the Italians are like this and the Dutch are like that. Even in the confines of our own project, we regularly clash about how things seem to be typically Dutch, typically Swedish, typically Italian. But it's good to realize that culture is highly dynamic and constantly changes. So what seemed typically Dutch 20 years ago has already changed, and the same goes for other cultures. And the same goes for organizational cultures, because so far I've identified national cultural differences, which is what people tend to talk about when they talk about cultural differences. But of course, there is also different layers of cultural difference, subcultures between even cities or towns a few miles apart may have a very different way of dealing with their environment and with each other, which I guess Karen will respond to in a second. And between organizations, the firemen and policemen may have a very different idea when they talk about particular routines that they're used to, particular things that they see as dangerous, like do you lock all the doors or to keep the villains out, or do you keep all the doors and windows open in case of a fire that everybody can escape? These very simple examples may illustrate how people work actually make people identify with different aspects and make, promote different behaviors and have shorthands for the things that they think that is clear to everybody, but often turns out to be not. So then we're in the domain of interculturality, of how different cultures interact with each other, clash or meet in their interaction, which especially is relevant in times of crisis when a lot of people have to work together in a very short time span. And as our team before this session already discussed, that is too late to try and identify cultures. You already should have an idea what kind of cultures you may engage in a disaster, because a disaster itself is too late to learn about culture, except for a very rapid intuitive response. So in the preparation phase, we should work out what kind of cultures, what kind of differences we may encounter in dealing with others in the domain that we work with, both with colleagues and with possible disaster victims and others who may be volunteers or gatekeepers. So a lot of misunderstandings can happen in this so-called trading zone between different organizations or different subcultures. Because we see our environment, our fellow human beings, and ourselves through particular lenses. We frame it in a particular way. It's influenced by our own cultural background, and we have come to see it as normal. But actually, we determine each other's realities. And so the moment that we interact with them, other people's framing of us may change, and our identity may even change in the process as a consequence of repeated interaction with each other in a positive or negative way. So one thing that you can do as in preparation to understanding cultures and possible clashes or encounters between cultures in a disaster situation is some ethnographic fieldwork to understand by immersion, by repeated exposure, close-up study of social and cultural environment of everybody around you, who seems or could be different from you, act differently, look differently, have different points of references. There are more qualitative approaches, such as interviews and mixed methods, something that we've also tried to do within EduSyn, and participant observation, but also more experimental things, for example, what we've tried to do within our project in inciting cultural memory, for example, by organizing an exhibition or by games. And our Polish partners are very good at making these games or selecting these games and adapting them. They don't always have to be developed from scratch, to emphasize, to immerse yourself in the experience of interaction with others, with different cultures. I think this is the last slide. When you're trying to help out people in an area that you don't know, you need to have access to them. Our colleagues in Milan have experienced this, trying to get access to the Turkish community. If you just send a letter or email or send a leaflet, that doesn't work. People are not necessarily going to trust you and feel comfortable with you. So you need other strategies to get access and enter into communication, information, and exchange. So to know who you should talk to, what is important to know, what kind of problems you envisage are things that you should all think in advance and if you don't, then you bump into it as you enter the domain. Local knowledge and tradition can you help you overcome some of these problems if you take them seriously, but also if you know how to recognize them. What is actually local knowledge, and how do you tell, say, experts from charlatans when you look for gatekeepers? How do you know who is really in authority? And do you think that perceptions play a role in humanitarian action or emergency response? That is one thing that we are finding out in this project, how actually this perception and framing of the other has an influence on how we actually identify others, engage with others, respond to others. So after this presentation, which based on a presentation that Bram Janssen has developed, so credit is due to Bram. I give the floor to a wholly original presentation by Karen Engel, who kindly came here to join the EduSend team from Nigeria, actually, where she lives, but more recently from the province of Limburg. And I'm looking forward to her presentation. And after this presentation, there's time for questions and particular talking points that hopefully you also contribute to. Thank you very much. Karen.
Okay, this is very strange because normally I'm in a setting where you have actual interaction with people. Okay, are there no questions? Because I don't know, like I would like to know kind of like, I can go everywhere. Like this, you know, culture is very broad. Culture and disasters is very broad. You can talk about a lot of different things. People encompass different cultures. There's not just one culture that really defines you or that guides you. There's a lot of them. Depending on the situation, you will prefer one over the other. So I don't know if there's anything that can kind of that I can include into my presentation so that I actually so that I can actually also include your questions so that I'm sure that whatever you want to hear is actually also presented. Is there anything specific regarding, for example, disaster subcultures or disaster management? All right. Well, then I guess I'll start. Okay. This will, maybe there is a little bit of overlap with what Jeroen said. Some other things will be new, useful, hopefully useful. The first thing, obviously, there's a lot of, like I also said, culture is very broad. I mean, essentially, it started out as something like everything that, you know, we do as people, as communities, to accommodate to a specific social setting, environmental setting. So there's a lot of different definitions. Over the years, people have approached it from different angles. People have looked at how people dance. People have looked at how people dress themselves. People have been in communities. And there's a lot of different approaches that have gone before us. Not, however, always as practical, because a lot of it has been observing, and culture is very complex. So when working with culture, before I started doing my PhD, I worked in more in the field of disaster management as a consultant, and particularly in Holland, I worked with floods and water, because water is a very important element of Dutch society. And if you pay attention to culture and you pay attention to your environment, you will see that wherever you go, you see the way the Dutch interact with water. If you, for instance, if you're flying over Holland and you look down, you see pretty much all of the different waterways, and you'll also see how everything is controlled. It's a man-made environment, and that man-made environment is guided by certain cultural principles. One of them, for instance, a lot of the people will know the delta works. The delta works are in my idea, a very complex technical artifact, which is also its material culture, which, if you interpret it, if you look at it, and if you take it into the whole Dutch society, you will see it's a very definitive one because it represents engineering. And if you look at the way the Dutch deal with water, it's it's an engineered resilience. It's enabling stability, ensuring that flooding will never ever happen again. If you take this approach to another country, like let's say Bangladesh, it will not work. One, because the resources are simply not there, and two, because the resources are not there, people have a different approach towards dealing with the water that they live with. So it's very definitive for Holland. However, can you just transport it to another situation? No, you cannot, because the logic on which it is based is very Dutch. So the moment also you start, you cannot just simply transfer any kind of these different cultural artifacts. You have to pay attention. Where are you going towards? And what problem is this solving? In Holland, it works. Somewhere else, it might not. At any rate, so working with flooding and with disaster management, it became very apparent that the natural environment is very influences culture and vice versa. So the way that I define culture, which has been useful in my work, has been a more practical, pragmatic way, and that's essentially that culture encompasses strategies, practices that communities turn to when dealing with certain challenges or opportunities. Cultural elements emerge when a certain environment or a certain society within a social or environmental natural environment is confronted with a certain challenge or potentially also opportunity. And they collectively decide we have to do something with it. And that's when they start producing culture. So even if, a lot of the times we see culture as dresses or specifically more for aesthetic purposes, oftentimes they actually have a very functional purpose. They are very functional. They are essentially an assemblage, a pool of resources that communities turn to encounter or to deal with a certain situation. So the Delta works, I hope a lot of people will know, they serve a specific purpose. They were created, and they were created to keep the water out, which is a specific value, keeping the land dry, protecting so that people can continue their life in a peaceful manner. Preventing is better than curing, which is also a very Dutch principle. This is all represented within these Delta works. That is why we positioned those and we invested in it. It was very expensive. But also now, if you start wondering, for example, about climate change and possible challenges that will bring, that is very difficult to potentially discuss within a Dutch setting when you very much believe in engineering and you believe in the capacities of human reason. Human reason, this might be an attitude, I'm not saying it is, but it might be an attitude that human reason will conquer. So we are not concerned, we are not, whatever we have created will be sufficient, and if not, then we put our engineers into it, and then we will, solve the solution. And we will be able to prevent whatever happens. We will maintain stability. But what happens then when something unexpected happens? There will not be any cultural assets that will actually enable people or societies to deal with these unexpected events because you're used to a very stable society. So culture really emerges when a society finds something problematic. This is when people have to start talking and when they actually have to start collectively producing something. And at the same time, then, culture is a pool of resources. Culture is what people do. Culture is what people have. So in times of emergencies, especially, this is what people will go towards. So if, for instance, as an emergency organization, you look at the people and you wonder, why the hell are these people going that way when I told them to go that way? That is the question that you have to ask yourself. Why do people why do they value this route better than the other one? Apparently, whatever solution you have provided is not valuable to the society you're dealing with. It might be, however, the communication there has a apparently then being effective, and you have to start understanding, why is my solution, is it appropriate for their situation? And if people are not actually doing it, that means that they're definitely not seeing the value of whatever solution you're providing them. So in that sense, it's essential for disaster management and eventually also disaster risk reduction, to look at what do people do and why do they do this. And in Chile, for instance, it's internationally, it's often recommended, if there's an earthquake, for people to stay in place and not necessarily go out, because statistically, internationally, there are a lot of people that get hurt in the process of trying to get out of the building. In Chile, generally, a magnitude 7 earthquake is not necessarily worth evacuating the building for, because everyone knows it will most likely not cause a lot of damage. Houses, the infrastructure, the material infrastructure is built to withstand. So people could potentially, if they decided to, stay in their building. However, they do not. Why do they not? Because it has been culturally, they have learned that it is valuable to flee. So independent of whatever international agencies will be saying you have to stay, they will flee, especially with a magnitude 7. Because they know, historically speaking, that a magnitude 7 earthquake might potentially lead towards a bigger one. It might be a foreshock of the actual main shock, which can cause a lot of damage within the country. And this has resulted, for instance, in a reduced death toll of the 1960 earthquake, which was a magnitude 9.5. The actual earthquake did not result in a lot of deaths, while this earthquake is essentially the biggest one ever recorded. And it also enabled, in a few other instances where it was also where earthquakes are also in certain other instances, that it also enabled people to indeed to flee and to stay outside. They generally stay outside, and it has saved them a lot. So if then an international organization would go there and would see this practice, they would most likely say, you should not do this. However, for the specific context that you're dealing with, it might be a valuable practice that they should upkeep, because it has resulted in less deaths. So these are things that you might encounter, and that are also important to take into account, because this is essentially what happens. Any kind of disaster will be local. So any kind of resources that they will turn to have to be local, and will therefore most likely be cultural. Let's see. Are there any questions? Okay, so then I just repeat it. Is this another one? Okay. I can take all. I think I can take all you. Someone has to tell me how much time do I have left.
An hour, but let's say 5
No,
minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Okay. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is the different cultural elements that a community has. And these are the resources that they will turn to. If, for instance, in Chile, you will notice that where I'm doing my research in Chile, I am half Chile. The main organizations to deal with disasters, and they have, or hazards, let's say, and they have quite a few, from volcanoes to earthquakes, tsunamis, etc., is informal. So if you start looking at the formal structures, which for instance you have in Holland, which you might have in the United States, where the formal organizations are very important, and you take this lens and you put it on the Chilean situation, you will not see anything. You will think that these people are absolutely incapable of dealing with an actual disaster. If you look at the actual results, you notice that in 2000 they had a major earthquake and a tsunami. Compared to Haiti, the impact is actually quite minor. There was absolutely no collapse. In certain communities, the impact was very minimal. In a few days, they were up and running again. The ones that were affected by the tsunami, they obviously had more material damage. However, if you really talk to them, the impact was still minimal. So then you have to wonder, so something is absorbing all of this impact. And most of the things that enable them to absorb that are the different tools and resources that they have developed over time and that are essentially cultural resources. So to come in with a view of, oh, you have absolutely nothing, and you start, you're not actually looking at what is the situation. You're looking with a certain model that does not fit the reality. And I'm pretty sure that in a lot of the different countries, also, like even in small countries like Holland, you will notice that per region, when more urbanized, most likely more complex, more division of labor, there will be more people that even, for instance, will look when there's an emergency, will seem incompetent, maybe passive. But this makes sense because they have organized, they have the different organizations, professional organizations, to deal with certain things. In a more rural setting, you don't necessarily have all of these specific professionalized organizations. So you will notice that people will start doing whatever they need to do. In an urban setting, most likely they will also. However, it might take more time because they have to reassemble the world around them. It doesn't make any sense anymore when the organizations are not there that are supposed to be. So for a long time, culture is often excluded because it is very messy. It's not very clear. I mean, sure, it's very clear to talk about music, to talk about the arts. Yeah, those are very obvious cultural elements. However, and those can, by the way, also give you a lot of information of what people would potentially do or how they perceive or how they value certain natural events, and how therefore you might have to do disaster management. But it goes beyond that because it's essentially everything that guides people. It guides behavior, it guides what you value. So the minute you ignore all of this, what are you working with? Maybe you're imposing a certain model or structure on top of something that most likely will not work. So we are trying in the disaster research, let's say, to look more at culture and try to make it more visible. And for a lot of people, especially when, well, this is something that I'm trying to do in Chile, for a lot of people, it's very strange because they're asking me, like, why do you find it interesting what I'm doing? Because it's very normal. But that's essentially what it is. It's what do you find normal? So in practical terms, if you're working and you find something out of the ordinary, you find something not normal, most likely you're dealing with a different cultural logic. So try to understand, try to go into debate and try to see why is this person doing this. I live in Nigeria. Most often, you really wonder, why do people do it this way? One thing is, especially if you actually have an objective to attain, you could potentially just get really angry and say, why are you not being reasonable, or why are you not, logical like I am? Or you can try and understand the logic behind it and see why do people do it and adjust to their system, because that's the system where you're trying to get the results. So I think I'm gonna leave it at that. If there's any question, please ask. Yeah.
Does anybody want to chip in? I was thinking of trying to think of an example of a group which we do not normally see as a culture, but that you could think about attributes that you can expect from their attitudes with respect to disaster risk. And that group is tourists. I'm relying on research of a student called Jelmer, who did his thesis with us and went to New Zealand to see how holidaymakers were prepared for disasters in New Zealand. And New Zealand has rather a lot of those, from storms to volcanoes to earthquakes. And it turned out that people don't prepare, basically. When they're on holiday, their attitude to risk is, hey, it's a holiday. Who cares about risk? We're here to enjoy. We don't want anything negative. So if you want to communicate earthquake risk to holidaymakers, you have a heavy task on your hand, which is heavier than for someone who is at work or who has young children that they feel protected towards, and so on.
Can I add?
Yeah, sure.
Because with tourists, we often think of obviously people from outside the country that might not even know the country. In Chile, one of the most of the victims from the most of the tsunami victims were internal tourists, were national tourists. They were people from Santiago, where they have a more, Santiago is very inland, there they have an inland culture, they do not have a sea culture. So these people did not know how to interpret their environment and did not evacuate in the ship. Most of the local communities, they did. So this is, I mean, if you're talking, I mean, this is even, I mean, you're talking about Santiago, which is not that far. Most of these people were maybe 2 hours away from their town along the coast. They did not have the sufficient, they were not part of the disaster subculture that was prevalent in the coastal community. So even a tourist just driving 2 hours, you might already be in danger.
So their situational awareness, as it were, is very low. People often don't know and don't really care where they are, except where their accommodation is, and if they have internet. Well, in a disaster, often for internet will be the first to go because there will be no electricity, no access. People often also in touristic situations live in a substandard accommodation. They're temporary accommodation like tents, caravans. In case of festivals, there may be all kinds of makeshift things that are good enough for a festival, but not good enough to withstand a heavy storm. A couple of years back, we had several festival-related disasters in Belgium, Netherlands, and in Germany, that I remember, that made victims or caused a lot of damage and panic because people didn't not really know where they were, and they were in things that could fall, that could break, that would not break or fall at home because they have more sturdy roofs over their heads and more sturdy materials to work with. Since we talked about that disaster and perception is related to each other, I think one of the things when looking at culture is also to imagine not only how we look at them, so in this case tourists as people who empirically are found to be less responsible in their preparation, but also how they look at us, as in this case probably as fussy and overly apocalyptic because hey, it's a holiday, so we want to be in a good mood. Which means that they're probably also less open to suggestions, to orders, unless you find ways of reaching core values, things, survival instincts, and stuff. So it is possible to have a strategy in advance towards tourists as a group. Although people have different age and gender and ethnic characteristics and religious beliefs and whatever, as a group of tourists, they're likely to be more or less bracketable into one particular group, particular attributes that we need to be prepared for. This is one of the things that that came to mind when I started thinking about culture, because we always talk about cultures as problems, like migrants or refugees, or as curiosities, people exotic. But actually, there are also groups that can be seen as cultures, as target groups with specific aspects, specific ways of behaving, and specific expressions that we do not. And that could be quite helpful also in a disaster risk reduction context. Another group that came to mind are Doomsday Preppers. They are the people who are overly prepared, you could say, in the sense that their house is full of stuff, food, water, tools, because they think that the disaster can happen any day, even though there is no physical scientific evidence for that. This is what they believe, or that there may be a space invasion, and there are quite some people who believe in that for various different reasons. So they are, you could say, they're too panicky, they're overly concerned, the exact opposite of the careless tourist. But they also have technical skills. They know how to they have studied how to behave in a disaster situation. And so if one happens, they bring technical and organizational skills that others may not have. So here's another group an identity group, because Doomsday Preppers may be loners, but often they know each other and exchange tips. So it's could also be one group to work with if there are Doomsday Preppers in your area that you may not have thought of. That could be quite useful in disaster preparation, and especially if you take away the pinches of salt of their disaster awareness and focus on the things that they have to bring. It could be a cultural asset. An example, two examples: the tourists as probably less aware people, and the Doomsday Preppers as probably more aware people that we could treat as disaster cultures. I hope all this made sense, and I hope that we get some responses.
In India. And well, you talked about the careless tourists in 2010 when there was the disaster floods in Ladakh. Many trekkers got caught in this flood, and most tourists that come to Ladakh see only the idyllic scene and cannot imagine that in a desert as such there can be flooding. And they attracted the emergency response. Helicopters of the army had to be mobilized to pick up them when they could have been mobilized to save people in the villages, and local communities had to take care of these tourists that got lost while they were still affected. So it has a serious impact. And because you talked about preparedness, I thought about my own experience because I was looking at how do people cope with changes and cope with disasters in this ecosystem. And most of the time, people did not had the idea of preparing for a disaster. It may be because disaster is a new thing for them, and maybe there is a lack of memory of disasters from the past. But when some local representative of the communities had the idea of building a hard structure for facilitating the evacuation of people who usually go in the mountain on the dry shade to hide. He thought about the idea of building a room that could be used in some of other purposes, and he really encountered strong resistance from other members of the community because the simple idea of preparing for a disaster event would, as I quote, it would be bad omen for them because you consider it might happen, then it might actually happen, or it might even be stronger because you prepared for it. And I think this is very important when you communicate about preparedness and disaster, how you make your prints, how do you present it to communities, and the phrasing you use doesn't.
Yeah, this is also one place where I would like to just say some last words. Because indeed, like one of the things that we have to realize that disaster management, disaster preparedness, disaster risk reduction, these are Western practices. If you start looking at indeed the world in general, and most of them live in rural communities or they live in urban sectors, etc., but they're dealing with their lives. They might not be doing disaster risk reduction as we are doing it. They might not have the cycle with the preparedness and prevention, mitigation, but they are doing a lot of things. So, like I was saying, also in Chile, like most of them, like if you look from this formal lens of, are you doing preparation, prevention, you will find absolutely nothing. However, if you really start looking at what people are doing, and that is the essence of things, because people are always dealing with hazards. So even when you encounter indeed, like it's a bad omen, this particular belief, it's serving some purpose. So the minute you start dismissing this particular belief, you're breaking something else. So you have to see, like, what is the purpose of believing this? Because for a lot of people, it might, for instance, be, if you're living in a very variable environment where a lot happens, this idea of actually being able to intervene and engage with your natural environment and controlling something might not be there. And it might actually serve the purpose for them to be more flexible, creative, and improvise. So when for me, the value lies always in try and see what is there, because these are resources and they have a certain specific purpose. So don't just come in with, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to be prepared. You need to have this. You need to blah, blah. Because one, they might be prepared, but maybe in a different way than you had actually envisioned. Something that might not, that we might not have encountered, but what does actually serve the social and environmental setting. Because the social setting is also very important. So the moment you, for instance, say it's much more important to build a dam than to, while this will actually break down the social networks that are within the community, these social networks will be necessary to start rebuilding. Again, maybe a small example from Nigeria. There's some, if a person is dying of a terminal illness, most likely they will be paying a church. They will go out of the hospital and they will start paying the church or whatever. They start giving them a lot of money, everything they have. Now you might think, well, that's stupid, there you have the university, the hospital, they have all the different technical whatever thingies to make his life, better, and maybe potentially you can live a day more, maybe you can live a week more. But then this person is not necessarily thinking about his own life. It's probably most likely thinking about the people he's leaving behind. And when this person, especially a man, will die, most likely the church will be the social resources. They will be the ones that will be able to take care of the family. Will be able to organize the whole funeral. And so, what is at that point more important? All the technical, scientific knowledge that has the hospital, or leaving your family and everyone you have behind in problematic. So, in this sense, always try that culture has a purpose. It's not just there to be annoying. It's there because people get a value out of it. This does not mean that it cannot change, and it does not mean that some, adding or adapting this culture is not necessary. It might be. However, it will take time, and for people to actually change their culture, they will have to see the need. If they do not find the need, if they do not see the, okay, yeah, it will be valuable because indeed, then my interests will indeed be better covered. If they do not see this need, they were not going to change. If they do not see that someone's solution will actually enable them to preserve to account for their needs, they're not going to change it. So the last one.
I have a question actually, because you were talking about how when do you know you're dealing with culture, and that it's often the case when you encounter a clash or a contrast, or when you see things and you think, that's different from normal. But how can you encounter your own culture? Because for me, my culture is normal, so I won't see it. And in a lot of disaster, for a lot of responders, I think it's very valuable they know about their own culture. So you have an idea.
It's true, and this is actually a very good question because this is also what makes culture difficult. The fact that indeed for you, most likely for you, it's your automatic pilot. It's how you deal with life. For you, it's very normal. And most likely another person will find it strange. So, for one, asking yourself, I think the most practical thing that you can put into practice is really just question it. And it's not very philosophical, but just, why do I do this? Why do I have a plan? Why do I need this plan? Why does someone else not have a plan? Why can they still work? What is improv? How do you define it? And these are, why do I do it this way and not the other way, when the other way can potentially be cheaper? Or why do I value what I do? But at the same time, be aware that you might also not necessarily want to know certain things about their culture, because they are, it's what you value. It's what you find important, and the minute you start questioning that can also put your own life in.
Well, can I respond to what
yeah,
you
for
just said,
sure.
because you've now taken a kind of individualistic answer to that, like introspection,
No,
which is very useful.
but also collectively as an
But it
organization,
can,
you have to.
there's also intervision with colleagues, and you can make a routine of asking these questions in a group, as it were, which probably usually more heads know more than one.
Oh yeah, and I would definitely say, like, ask. I mean, when you know, in this philosophical sense, like, if you're in an organization, you will also have a certain. So you know, together start questioning why do we do it the way we do?
Yeah.
Why do we act?
And as you say, that can be quite confrontational. In your earlier answer, you gave some examples from Nigeria, from Chile, which is for a Northern European quite nice to see as a contrast. But of course, we can see it closer home. First of all, there are a lot of refugees now coming into Europe, so we are confronted by others who are different, but also see us as different, and maybe not as different as we thought. Usually, there's a lot of protest of people coming as refugees, especially to local smaller communities that feel overwhelmed. But then when they have to leave, people say, don't go because we've just started to get to know you. So this is an example of the interaction between cultures, which also leads to different framing of each other, different reality making of each other. But even closer to home, to go back to Mona's question, is people really in the West too are not happy to talk about bad things that could happen because they feel, from a kind of superstition that we may all share, it is talking about it is kind of willing it to happen. In my family, you didn't talk about death or serious disease because if you talked about it, it almost felt like it was more likely to befall you. And the same goes all kinds of knock on wood and four-leaf clover and all kinds of examples. That is also the reflected in our own Edusen logo, this four-leaf clover, not for nothing. It's one of the reasons why I like it, because exactly it's this kind of beliefs that we have, which we may not even want to admit are superstitious, but of course they are. Think that they will bring us luck. Religious people may set a lot of store by prayer, and if you say to them, "Yeah, that's not going to help you," then you upset their beliefs. That makes a part of who they are, of their identity. And interestingly, sometimes these things, as we talked earlier, actually seem to help. That people like faith healers or people who have specific gifts may accomplish things that we would not think as possible, and we would dismiss as charlatanism or as superstition. It's. I come back to a question that I asked before: is how do you tell the wheat from the chaff? How do you see people who are really have special things to give them, cultural practices that are very useful, and cultural practices that are destructive, or individuals that pretend to be cultural experts but turn out to be frauds?
Well, from my perspective, I would see it slightly different because I mean we see this the charlatan. Like sometimes they have different functions that are not necessarily like we see like okay you have a doctor and a charlatan. The doctor is supposed to heal you. A charlatan cannot necessarily might not have necessarily the function of healing. I mean all of these different cultural elements that different cultures have. They serve different purposes. Like I said, like the religion or the church. A church might provide, you know, functionally, you might think, you know, will give you, I don't know, guidance in the way God created the world and how you should live, etc. But it also is so much more. It's also an institution. There's also people. It's network. It's you get so much more out of it. So in that sense, the first thing I would potentially ask, not necessarily what is the rubbish, the things that you will encounter will most likely serve an important purpose for this community. And so first thing is why is this person here? And why do people apparently value this person? Even if it's, you know, might sound like rubbish in our perception and what a person should should do, and then start seeing, is this valuable? Is this truly? So the same with these different superstitions. And for people, especially in certain circumstances where you are living with a lot of variability, it might best to just believe in God and say, what happens will happens, and otherwise we'll deal with it. And it was, it might also give them strength. So to immediately dismiss it as something, oh, it's spiritual, it's then you're also taking away the strength, which is actually might be a foundation of community. So I would always try and find what is the purpose, why do people value?
I agree, and I start to enjoy the whole conversation, but I don't want to exclude our patient participants. So you're still very welcome to chip in and knock on the door through sending a chat in the chat function if you want to make a comment or a question. Now, to pick up where you left off, of course, we talk about this interface between responder, whether voluntary or professional responder, trained responder, or so-called victim. Or a victim doesn't have to be a passive victim. And let's say that one of those are a religious and the other are not, or they are from totally different religions. I know that in certain Catholic areas in the south of Italy, for example, people see the Virgin Mary as a kind of part of the family who's closer to God than all of us. So if they want something, if they need something, if they feel a need for certain aid, they are more likely to pray or to look for spiritual guidance than to call the police or the fire brigade or other kind of professional responders. Is that bad? You can say we should respect religion for what it is, for what it means to people. You don't want to take away their ontological security, what they feel safe and at home with, their identity by trying to explode what you might see as a myth or as a fallacy. But then, does it make it better?
But they do make it better. Well, in this sense, I mean, essentially, this is a reality. So if you are a professional organization and you do actually want to work within such communities and with these people, I think the only way to do it is by acknowledging and respecting that which enables their survival. Because they will also, I mean, at one point, and especially as an emergency organization, you come in and you leave, and you're leaving them behind. So there's a very short intervention. And if in that intervention, you leave them worse off by, for example, because one of the strongest and one of the most important capacities that a human being has and a community has to recover is cognition, is the mind. I mean, this is what enables a certain integrity when all the material world breaks down. If you start breaking down these intelligible means that people have, then you leave people behind worse off than they are. And I definitely would wonder whether that would be something that you would do. So in that sense, when you're preparing as also a professional organization, and this is what you mentioned earlier, everything you do has to be before, because at the moment of an emergency, and everyone that works in emergency will know, this is when you start going to your automatic pilot. You just do what you're trained in. And if you have an agile organization, you will look into creativity, improv, but you cannot do not have a lot of cognitive room to solve difficult problems or to encounter and be questioning, is this a culture? Is this something that can we go into the discussion?
Nah. You can only think fast.
You have to do, and that makes sense. So, and you will hurt. I mean, there will be harm, but indeed, trying to do this before, try to get to know what is the community they're dealing with. If you don't know, if you're coming in because it's a centralized organization, you come in, try indeed to find, and you will notice immediately where people, like certain key characters that will know, ask them, engage with them, and try and see and try to build and work on top of what they have, because they often do have a lot. And there's often a lot of different organizations, a lot of different communities. I mean, the professional organizations, they only do a very limited amount of the work. Most of the work is always done by the local people who eventually have to recover, they have to rebuild, they have to, continue living where they are. So I would say not ignore it and build with it, because you might, they have to live in there, you can do it.
I have one more question for you, and that is, I mean, I introduced you, Karen, as PhD student, but before you started as a PhD student, you had a professional life as a crisis researcher in this so-called COT in Leiden University, and in that capacity, you evaluated a crisis exercise, the flood exercise, which was not only a desktop exercise, but actually some real life role play action with people in uniforms from different countries, different cultures. And this, of course, why I'm interested in this particular case. Not just organizational cultures, but also national cultures try to work together to respond in a scenario way to a flood in the north of the Netherlands.
Yeah.
How is culture important here?
Has culture important?
Pluses and its minuses.
Well, this also reminds me of it triggers a few experiences that I had as a researcher then. Regarding the actual exercise, you noticed immediately we were talking, we had the UK involved, Poland, Belgium, Holland, and Germany, I think it was, maybe also Lithuania. And all of them came together in the north of Holland to indeed recreate a flooding situation, flood scenario. And they would all come and help. And it was really quite interesting, although obviously at the end everyone said everything went really well and there were a few lessons learned most likely regarding communication and coordination, because those are always difficult areas. The important elements were, one, between different organizations, also from within a country. A military organization will be very different, at least in Holland. I'm talking about now, like I said, the Dutch military. The military is very different to the civil services, which is, for example, the fire department. The fire department is considered here, it's a civil organization in the sense they're not military. So if, for instance, you have a conference with military guys and fire department, the military will be in uniform, the fire people will most likely be in a suit. They're civil servants, which is different in other countries. But at any rate, so what you notice in this exercise between the two, at one point there was talk about a possible flooding of, okay, you have one province in Holland which is created, which was man-made, and it has two main cities. It's essentially it's holding the water. It's, we pump the water out and you have land. And there's two cities, and you can put a dam in between, and that will save one of the cities, depending on where the flooding is. At one point in time, civilians had to take the decision of what are we going to do, because they are responsible. And you notice that the military was taking over slowly, because these are militaries that are like they had to do the civil military cooperation, but they're not used to very long and lengthy decision-making processes. So they were actually at that point. They were slowly but surely trying to take over the decision-making process. Well, obviously, all the others were not necessarily agreed, but they could potentially, and we pondered this, like at one point, like if there would actually be an emergency, most likely they will, independent of all the civilians. Like they will be like, okay, this is taking too long, we're going to do it like this. So this is something that I also, for example, encountered in a search and rescue mission of the Dutch in Pakistan. One of the problems was the working methods between military and civilians, the fire department. They were both there, they were in the same camp, but the military is used whenever they go on a mission. The mission is you leave home, you're in a mission. You come back home with your family, that's the end of the mission. For the fire, it's at least here in Holland, the missions are very limited. Like you go to a fire and you come back. You go to another fire and you come back. And so your base is essentially the fire station. So in Pakistan, when they were working, the fire department, whenever they would come back to their camp, this is when they would relax, they would drink coffee, they would chill. all the military thinking, what the hell are these guys doing? You know, we're still on a mission. We have to work. It's like working 24/7 until you come home. That's when you start getting your compensation. And this can cause a lot of friction. So even within the same culture, technically they're Dutch, they speak the same language, but a very different organizational culture, which can cause a lot of issues when you're actually in the field. So yeah, this is just a few examples of that.
I was, I don't know, is Helena still here? Yes, because you joined the exercise last week in Marken, the village, the big flood exercise, and there was also involvement of the military. And I was wondering, did you see similar things happen between the military and other organizations? And if not, is it just, did it just go really well, or was there maybe something that should be different in the next exercise to find those kind of frictions? Oh, your laptop is crashing, I'm sorry.
So Helena would like to talk to us, but her technology is not
Of course,
helpful.
you're always welcome to. I believe you were going to share your observations anyway, so we are looking forward to those. And well, I'm curious to hear what you think. Thank you.
So people with still working non-crashed laptops, Mona or others, would you want to make a, I would say, a final question or remark?
Some people already left, so if there are no questions, I think we will.
We'll close this session, which
Hope it was helpful.
hopefully was helpful and
Yeah.
certainly entertaining for us.
Yes.
And we will share the recordings of the webinar, and people who have questions, so who didn't join but who have questions because they watched the recordings, they're always welcome to send them to us to share them, and we will try to answer them.
And just a reminder that on the 17th, we are going to have our second webinar, which we will advertise to a slightly larger group. It will be on disaster and disability, and the main keynotes will come from our Educen project member, participant, consortium member, Çağlar Agüngör from the search and rescue organization in Istanbul called Akut. He will be talking about the Turkish experience with involving people with disabilities in disaster risk reduction. Again, not only as difficult or strange or unusual target groups for one-size-fits-all disaster risk reduction, but as people with their own abilities and group culture and languages. So that's on the 17th. That's Thursday week, a week from now. The 17th, again on this same time slot, 3 to 5 in the afternoon. And we hope you will join us again and also spread the word so that we will have a wider group of participants. Thank you for your attention, and we're looking forward to seeing you, meeting you again soon digitally in the next webinar. Thank you and good night.